到礼拜三通常我们是非常忙碌的非常忙碌、非常拥挤的那个国际学者一直不断的那个演讲不断的。今年是因为2020年因为这个COVID-19 的关系所以我们这边生意很淡其实幸好我们这边不用付租金，否则的话搞不好会 out of business 那个我觉得全球的那个企业可能都遭受到很大的这个打击。OK， 所以我们其实是非常难得的有那么今天这么一场演讲，而且那个讲题是非常非常难得的科学史的和科学哲学的两位两篇演讲然后我们的两位讲者呢都可以用双语那个中英文双语，所以我们今天讨论其实事实上是可以很尽兴，虽然说今天到场的是不多，因为我们的主题其实现在目前我觉得搞不好10年15年以前我们手上会有更多的人更多的研究生参与但是那个目前会比较显得偏僻一点那但是我非常高兴，因为这些都是我非常感到兴趣的这个题目，我也知道今天参与的可能都是比较具有特殊观点兴趣的那我现在就介绍一下那个我们两位讲者那么首先是涂子谦他是台中人，对不对？没错对，我们在台中还一起散步到东海大学校园去。
不是我的 origins 我在马来西亚出生。
你在马来西亚
出生，只是在那边出生，然后之后就出来了。
可是
就在台湾对。
你的ancestor
然后也有我 ancestor 有那个南投的布农族，还有大陆的那个。
这个你都搞清楚了。
对。那个。这个莆田，你看我注意这个都被录下来了，是不是？可以在。对，我爸爸那边是莆田人，就是少林寺那里。然后呢，也有回去过老家。然后呢，妈妈这边是台湾人，算是也有就是汉人跟那个不能。对。我想找一个时间也学一下。语言，因为我不会。
我有过推演经验，我还可以。别人用不能语讲电话，我可以。
是的，哇 OK， 那你教我。
OK， 涂子谦虽然涂子谦教授虽然很年轻，可是他有非常非常有趣的那个curriculum vitae 这个大家可以讲，他现在是在英国的 University of Bristol 教学，然后但是以前他曾经在 Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht 马斯垂克的那个 Jan van Eyck 学院叫做研究院然后那个 École Normale Supérieure 就是法国高的师范学院。那个在巴黎的高等师范学院，然后在柏林是在柏林的那个Max Planck 研究中心是科学史的研究，然后柏林的 Brandenburg Academy of Science 还有Institute for Research in the Humanities 在 University of Bucharest
在罗马尼亚
and the University of Milan 那个意大利米兰大学，所以我说他非常有意思的这个 curriculum， 他现在那么现在在工作的是那个18世纪物理里面的因果律它是英果论英果论律也行OK 然后他也是马迪乌的数学存有论的研究议题，现在目前还有那个代数的哲学，还有那个莱布尼兹在20世纪的接受史接受史然后还有以及跟今天题目相关的 那个语境主义的批判，作为语境主义作为历史方法论的一种批判啊。我们的第2位讲者，博佳佳，Charlotte Ballet，他是位法国人，然后但是你会知道他的中文非常好，中文背景也非常好，然后目前是在交通大学通识中心教书。他的研究兴趣是包括科学史、数学史啊，里面包含了代数、组合数学和几何，然后这个历史与哲学的比较研究，然后还有古代以及中世纪的中国数学、中国古代语 ，OK， 应该是这样讲，古代与中世纪数学，然后在 Chinese 和 Sanskrit 就是梵文啊，那个中文和梵文语境之下的那个古代和中国数学啊，然后还有族群数学啊，这个 ethnomathematics，OK，yeah，interesting，还有 SKS 啊，然后以及这个这个很有意思，就是 philosophy for children。
Yes, people say.
Yes, right. Yeah, like Jean-François Lyotard's, postmodern for children something. Yeah.
本来就是 postmodern。
Yeah.
里面加他们 postmodern。
Right. Okay.
Philosophy for Children is a UNESCO project.
Okay. 好，所以说2位非常有趣的讲者，然后我们今天大概前半段就是有2位讲者评论，我想就是原来那个博佳佳原来我们邀请的是作为一个 discussant 或者那个 intellectual 那但是我看就是博佳佳的这个演讲既有回应既有回应涂子谦的题目，但是它本身又是一个独立的一篇演讲，所以我们大概可能我们这个前半段就是这2篇演讲，然后这2篇演讲的涂子谦的讲的题目是时序错置的辩护，哲学和科学史中的语境主义与推测论述 ，A Defense of Anachronism, Contextualism and Speculation in the History of Philosophy and Science。OK， 然后博佳佳的那个讲题是语境与证据，关于古代数学史的辩论 ，The Context and the Proof，the current debate in history of ancient mathematics。OK， 好，那我们非常高兴。
Before we start, we need to make sure will the English be necessary? I mean, could you understand Mandarin Chinese? No.
I understand.
But how about you?
Not really.
No, then we still need to do it in English. Yeah, slow.
Okay.
Or.
But don't worry. You can do
I'll
it.
go back and forth.
No. You can do it in Chinese. It's okay if you prefer in Chinese. No, don't worry.
No, it's okay. I can do it in both. It's
Even in French.
Ça va. Je vais essayer. Je vais dans 3 langues. 所以很感谢你们的邀请，我这一次回来，因为休研究假，所以呢通知了2位老师，然后也是以前很熟悉的朋友。然后呢，很怀念以前，就是差不多10年前在交大的这个大会里面认识的大家。
He was
Yeah.
here, right?
2009.
2009.
2009, I first met you and I discovered your really lively, very enthusiastic group of students, some of which I've continued to be friends with. All thank you for having come a long way to listen to me and to have this opportunity to discuss. Was always very impressed by the energy and the level of discussion and the over and above everything, the interdisciplinary spirit of your center, and I'm very happy to see that it has really grown. I always love to come back to visit you, and so thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and a tremendous pleasure of mine. And so among all the topics that I do, I think at the time in 2009, I was much closer to French philosophy. I was much more inside some of the topics. I think I gave a talk on Agamben that time. And I've kind of moved a little bit more away. So when I proposed some topics to the two professors, they picked this, which is, I guess, closer to the sort of general topic of cultural studies, which would also involve some history and the questioning of what constitutes history, what it means to do history, what kind of evidence do we need for doing history. So I proposed this, and super long preface to my talk. It's a paper that I want to write, but I haven't written it yet. And this opportunity gave me a chance to first to put together some of the elements of a paper to come. And so, if you have other suggestions, please ask me. Please ask me to clarify when I'm unclear. So this is very much, I apologize, a work in progress. It's not a finished paper. Has not been reviewed anywhere. It's barely been reviewed by me. So I just put together some elements, and then my hope is that we can have a broader discussion and use this opportunity to talk about different things. So I'm not going to. 大家都 OK。我说这个只是一个还在进行中的一个研究，我做的不习惯，会觉得有点。So 这样 OK 吧？对不对？这你们有没有 clicker？ 还是用滑鼠？一定要用。
我去借。
他可以去。
OK， 那OK， 所以 defensive anachronism， anyway title 不用再介绍，we don't have to introduce the title anymore. So the most important figure, I think, in recent political history, philosophical history, history of ideas, intellectual history, all of these disciplines, involved in the historical assessment of texts. It's really related to text. Really, it hit a moment of a slow revolution in the work of Quentin Skinner, most famously in his essay, Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas, basically arguing that what is considered to be history of ideas is mostly mistaken. So he's a kind of revolutionary type thinker. Although Skinner's work didn't really catch on until a little bit later, but his main opponents were what was really popular in the 70s. One is esoteric reading. You might be familiar about this from the conservative philosopher Leo Strauss. Does people know about Leo Strauss? Yeah? Okay, good. Very good. So Leo Strauss' influence is very, very wide, especially in the field that Skinner works in, which is political philosophy, the history of political philosophy. So that's the first opponent, is Quentin Skinner. Leo Strauss. What's the? OK。那这个嘞，这个我们可以把它拿出来，是吧？这个是滑鼠的，这个是我的，我可以把它拿出来。
你的存下来的，你存到。
我没有存，可是。
这存到桌面上比较保险。
那这个嘞？这个投影机。
不是，这个是
这个，那就没有，这个拿掉。
对。
So the main opponent is textualism. Esoteric reading of Leo Strauss. So what is esoteric reading? Esoteric reading is that we need to read between the lines. We need to understand what the author is not saying, right? So you can see how so the key figure for him were key figures writing in the context of persecution and writing in the context of censorship, right? So what we need to read from a text, right, is what the author didn't say, right? So if you're being persecuted by the church in the 16th century, you have reason to think that you might want to read what the author didn't say, right? So But what that allows you, what that brings you down is you have to decide beforehand what the author is trying to say. Right? You have to already, based on no evidence whatsoever, decide what the author is trying to say. Somebody like Hobbes or Machiavelli or Spinoza, you have to decide what they're trying to say and then read into the text, right? And this is, Skinner thinks this is a really bad way to go, right? Because even if we can understand persecution, what we're doing is we're laying over the text an ideology that's we already decided, right? And so what does that lead to? Anachronism. That's the main point of view. The second bit is textualism. Textualism is an overconfidence in the idea that you can understand what an author from a previous time thinks, that you could judge what they're going to say, right? And this is maybe more of the point, because I think we are all somehow textualists, right? When we read a text like Mengzi, right? We think we just have to understand what the words say, right? We just read what the words say. But the two terms here, meaning and understanding, Skinner argues, you don't get meaning and understanding from reading the text, right? You need to have a context, right? So his maxim from his 1609 essay is, no agent can eventually be said to have meant or done anything which could never be brought to accept as a direct description of what he meant or done. So we have to use the language of the people, and we have to understand that language within the context of their way. So I chose a really, really angry photo of Quentin Skinner. He is a little bit like this. But there's also a nice photo of Quentin Skinner. And this is his kind of work. I think his work is extremely important. Hobbes and Republican Liberty and Liberty Before Liberalism are both really, really important books. Also because Hobbes is often, if anyone knows anything about political philosophy, Hobbes is understood as the sort of authoritarian, right? So, Xi Jinping probably loves Hobbes, right? This idea you have to impose order, because without order there will be internal conflict, and if you have internal conflict, that's worse than authoritarianism, right? It's kind of China's for the last 3,000 years, basically has this ideology. So, but what Skinner tries to do is he tries to read another kind of Hobbes, right? A Hobbes that is concerned with liberty, but not liberty in the modern liberalism sense of liberty, right? Not a liberty that is based on property, right? But a liberty that reflects an older tradition, a tradition of the Roman essayists and the Roman Republic, right? So, and that is a general blind spot in all the people who discuss freedom and liberalism, right? They all liberty is reduced to a Lockean, Rousseauian, a 17th century liberalism view of liberty, right? We lose a big tradition. And so his main opponent here is Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin famously writes the essay defending negative freedom, negative liberty, in this counterposing, say, Marxists on the one hand and liberals on the other hand, or let's say Marx and Mill, basically, right? And Skinner really discovers another kind of freedom, Republican liberty. Anyhow, that's his work. So what is the methodology? The methodology is to use Wittgenstein and J.L. Austin's philosophy of language to say that what is important isn't simply what is said, but its force. So the same sentence in 4 different contexts can be described as a description, right? It could be a joke, right? It could be a joke. It could be an attack, right? So the meaning is we need to understand the pragmatic force of an utterance instead of simply what it says. That is what Skinner calls meaning. And grasping the meaning is called understanding. Right? So our whole point, his whole point is we try to understand the text. We're trying to understand the text. So in a more recent essay, which addresses some critics, he says, so the methodology is to interpret text within the web of texts within which it is situated, right? So the development of interlinked terminology and concepts. So he says, quote, the problems to which writers see themselves as responding may have been posted in a remote period or even a wholly different culture. You know, Charlotte probably knows about this much more than I do, right? The appropriate context for understanding the point of such a writer's utterance will always be whatever context enables us to appreciate the nature of the intervention constituted by the utterance. Not just the sentence, not understanding the sentence. So reading a sentence of Mozi or of Mengzi, right, is not just understanding what the sentence says, but what Mengzi or Mozi is responding to. Right? What that intervention constitutes, right? To recover the context in a particular case, we need to engage in extremely wide-ranging as well as detailed historical research, you can imagine. Right? So what he does is he gives historians of ideas, intellectual historians, a new kind of task. Right? And so eventually that sort of really led to a big shift in methodology, a challenging traditional views in history and political thought, for example, Skinner contra Berlin, history of Renaissance science, Schaeffer and Chapin, basically contesting the idea that there's a scientific revolution at all. We still use the terminology scientific revolution all the time, right? Got Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes. You know, Schaeffer and Chapin challenged the idea that there is or was ever a scientific revolution, for example, by looking at the context. Because the idea of a scientific revolution is itself a kind of anachronistic textualist reading, right? We already believe there's a scientific revolution. Then we go and we look at Galileo for evidence that there is a scientific revolution, right? Instead of saying, you know, maybe there isn't a scientific revolution, we look for the continuity. We find equal amount of stuff, right? So is there a scientific revolution? We can throw that question aside for the moment. And early modern natural philosophy, this has really made a huge impact. When I studied philosophy, history of philosophy, history of the 17th century, the 17th century continental and Anglo philosophy was introduced to me via the empiricists versus the rationalists. Right? 那个中文怎么说？这个经验主义跟这个理性主义，对，就是笛卡尔、Spinoza、莱布尼兹理性主义，洛克、Hume， 这个是这个empiricism。他们那个时候的人都没有用这个字，他们也不知道这个是什么。Right? Empirical 的 origin，empiricism 的 origin 是那个罗马帝国的医学的一个学派。Empiricism comes from Roman, a sect of Roman medicine, right? An approach to medicine is empiricism. 17th century people didn't use the term at all. Right? It was an invention of later people like Kant and people like that, right? About 100 years after the so-called empiricists or the so-called rationalists, they didn't use it at all, right? So now we're challenging how to understand 17th century natural philosophy by revising terminology that we use to understand. And to understand maybe there's a difference. They used, instead of empiricism, they used experimentalism, which is the concrete legacy of the 16th century philosopher Francis Bacon. Right? The Francis Bacon famously says, knowledge is power. Like Francis Bacon. Right? Knowledge is power. France is bacon. 这是 on my colleagues' door. Knowledge is power. France is bacon. Okay. Okay. So big data is so we're now in the age of big data, as you all know, and they're used to do this kind of. It can't arrive at the right time. Skinner arrived at the right time because big data allows us to do a lot of this kind of stuff. So if you can see, there are two really important projects now on early modern in my field, which employ some of this methodology. So So you can track all the letters of the scopulism. Oh yeah. So you can, for example, study a figure like Comenius by all of their, again, contextual summary. You can track him by all of his these are the contributors to the project. You can track them by all the catalog of their letters, right? And this kind of letters, kind of help you constitute a framework for which you have the net, right? You can look at all the letters that he did, and you can compare them back and forth. In the age of, I don't know, 随便选一个. In the age of big data, you can have context, you know where they were, different, how many letters they sent, in what year, right? In what year? You can do all this kind of stuff, and more important, like you can do all this kind of stuff. I mean, this is only the first stage of their project. They're gonna do more. They're gonna do maps even eventually. 怎么回到刚才在这里是不是 ？Yeah， 这个又更好玩一点。Republic of Letters， 他们 this is a bit more closed project, but they using kind of even more case study wise. So for example, you're interested in Voltaire, for example, you could see his correspondence network as a map. You could these are all sampled. They're gonna publish this later, but they're still working on it. So you could look at the participants by nationality, who he was talking to, his correspondence, what portion are letters, what portions are this kind of thing. Right? And Voltaire, you would think, is a fairly famous, fairly famous, one of the most famous thinkers ever to exist on this planet. But there's this entirely new approach to studying Voltaire, which was not, right? You could imagine a professor of French or political history. The way they studied Voltaire 50 years ago was read Voltaire. You read Voltaire, you explain to your students what it says inside, right? And perhaps you have a very good memory. You can have the encyclopedic memory of all the correspondences of Voltaire, but you can't have this, right? They maybe have an intuition about this, but they don't have this. And so you can see that contextualism, for example, Benjamin Franklin versus Voltaire, you have sort of, they're intermediary people, you can read their letters, like what these words, when they use the word liberty, for example, I'm just using an example from what Skinner does, right? What they mean, what their intervention is, isn't simply what the words are saying. So I just wanted to give a nice defense of contextualism before I start attacking it. Okay. So, oh yeah, and there's also other. So I think when Christian Mercer last year wrote The Contextualist Revolution, I think it's really when contextualism has really won, right? In the sense that very few, if you write something in my field, in the history of philosophy, which is not done in a contextualist way, you probably will not get published, right? So they definitively won. Okay, definitively won. But Mercer has a less heavy theoretical reason to assume the contextualist position. For her, it's the getting things right constraint. So whatever you say, whatever you do in the history of philosophy, you want to get it right. You want to make it factual. Okay, you want to make it as factual as you can. And the opponent this time is slightly different, right? So she thinks of the opponent as rational reconstruction, which is often what we do anyway when we read, against presentist and appropriationist versions. So a presentist version is probably the most familiar one. I already talked about it. It's the kind of thing we assume when we think about textualists. What does the philosophy professor do when they read Plato, for example, right? They imagine that Plato is there, presentist, right? The text of Plato is their contemporary, right? And we're trying to find the reason for Plato's arguments in the book as if he was there, right? So a presentist idea. So to not worry so much about the ancient time, we're trying to find what we have in common with Plato, right? And the second is the appropriationist perspective, right? So what we're trying to do is we have our own intellectual problems, right? We have our own intellectual problems, and we're looking in the past to find things we can use, appropriationist, right? So we have a crisis, we have an issue with borders, for example. I know that's a topic in 交通大学, so we go in the past and we try to look for different ways in which borders or bordering, these kind of things have come up, and we take it to use in our own context, right? So those are the two opponents in Mercer, right? And the main flaw with both of those is anachronism again. Right? The problem is anachronism.
I want to just double check 那个
大家
中文的同
大家
学都
OK 的，
可以
我
吗？
讲英文讲有点，因为我就是
那兴奋的时候就讲快了，
我就讲快了。
那同学们都可以吗？
对，你们可以问问题，都没有问题。
不要客气哈，就说如果真的有不懂，马上举手，免得后面的那更难跟上嘛，对不对？好，那个
我现在就是只有解释 contextualism 是什么，它有什么用处，它为什么好，就是对。
appropriate
对 appropriationism 对
讲一下他的那个从比较早先的
对
过来，他比较特别的是，
他没有那么的强硬，就是 Skinner 认为呢，他所有的 meaning 都只能从 context 里面有好好铺平的 context 里面才能有那个 locutionary force。那个语境，它设定那个句子那个发言呢的用意跟那个 impact 这样子。那在 Mercer 的 paper 里面，它比较没有那么的强烈的需要这样子很足的这样子的一个 context， 对不对？这样子一个语境，他只说基本上我们如果大家有对这个文章呢是有想要把它原来的味道呈现出来，这样子的一个方向，其实就差不多够，对。
中文好像比较接近的是叫做拿来主义。
是 appropriationism 拿来主义。
就是文本是什么就是什么吗？什么叫拿来？
其实拿来，我们现在理解怎么用它，就这样
就好了，对，就好像所以这个是两个它针对的两种做法。OK， 第一种呢就是把那个古代的人或者中世纪或者 early modern 早现代的人，把它当成是我们的人。读孔子呢，就把《论语》当成是我们的邻居说的话的样子，你知道我的意思 ？OK， 那 appropriationism 就是拿来主义。我们现在有什么问题？我们回去找一找，以前有遇过这个问题吗？有，我们拿过来，所以叫拿来主义。我们拿过来用，是这个意思，是这个意思吗？
我觉得可能最接近的。
对，而且我觉得其实我们常常做这个哲学啊，这个文学啊，我们基本上第一个 gear 呢，第一档就一定是这个 appropriationism 跟 presentism。我们要被训练，不做那个我们才会不做。
拿来主义也是通常是负面意涵的，
对，
就是指的你就是拿来主义的。
对。
我的好奇就是为什么他们可以算是 contextualism 的 variant？
不是，我是说他 contra， 他那一张文章呢，反对的就是对，因为他以前因为那个Skinner 的敌人呢是不一样的，他 Skinner 的敌人是70年代的敌人，60年代的敌人，就是Leo Strauss 跟一些这个好像 phenomenology 里面的那种 hermeneutics 的那种 textualism， 就是跟着 text， 只有 text 存在，全部世界可以就是融化掉、化解掉在后面，就是只有 text 存在。text 是这个主体，对不对 ？text 是主体。那其实说到最后，那个这个结构主义 Derrida 的 deconstruction 也是，他虽然反对 textualism， 可是他的假设是 textualism。对他假设 textualism 把它内部的化解，内部的这个 deconstruct。
所以先找到它的 structure。
所以呢，我们其实我觉得法国从来没有走出过这个 textualism 这个 tradition， 可是呢，最近这10年来，这15年来，大家也慢慢走进这个 contextualism 这样子的一个做法。OK， 可以吧？我又重新的讲一次。对，所以他的敌人又是不一样，他的敌人就是可以算是他的敌人是现在的主流用英文的哲学家 ，Anglophone philosophers， 最常的那种 presentists， 对不对？我们去听哲学演讲的时候，大部分的人都把他的演讲的题目当成是他的邻居，对不对？对啊，就是现在的人讲的话，那就拿那个 text 就直接念完他的 argument 是什么，我们要下什么结论。我们批评他的时候，也不管他的那个历史背景，我们只是说他管他里面的那个用道理的方法或者推理的方法，我不去太管他那个后面的 context。
所以一直说应该要就是在去讲说他是处在什么时代，然后他想回应什么问题，是要去
对，那个意思就是说，我们如果真的要做严重的真正的 contextualist 的话，我们需要他们的讲的就是说，连那个字的意思我们都不知道，我们没有 understanding， 我们以为我们知道，因为我们会加入我们很多我们的偏见在里面，我们现在用你的方式，好像我们可能大家我不知道谁读哲学系的，可是哲学系里面读到那个 Descartes 的 Meditation on First Philosophy 的第4章的时候，他有讲 objective reality。objective reality 其实对 Descartes 来说是我们的 subjective reality。那个时候用 objective 这个字呢，刚刚好是我们用的相反。所以常常我因为我教哲学入门，所以每年都会有这样子的事情发生。对，他读不懂 objective reality 到底是什么？你看他在解释他 objective reality， 他其实是 subjective reality， 就是客观跟主观那2个字的意思完全颠倒。OK， 所以意思就是说，我们常常会把我们现在用字的方法来把它套在，然后我们就读不懂，或者觉得这个东西很奇怪。OK， 我真的解释够了，可以了哈。OK， 还有一个 variant 呢，就是 permissible anachronism。permissible anachronism， 也是 contextualist。So Nick Jardine 的 uses and abuses of anachronism in the history of sciences 差不多2000年了。其实 it's a really interesting article. I'm not able to completely summarize it. It's very interesting, but it's overall affirming contextualism, but also affirms the necessity of anachronism. So, what the methodology is, he uses Peter Winch 2 axes of reality, 2 axes of reality and representation. Okay, so this is. I assign this every year to my students, and every year I interpret it a little differently. So an example is of high reality category is Halley's Comet, for example. So for example, Halley's Comet is observed in 240 BC in the 史记. Okay, and then Halley's Comet plays a really, really important role in Newton's life, right? In Newton's development of his new physics. Because it was the first application of the calculations in the Principia Mathematica. In 1682, him and Halley correctly predicted the return of the comet, and it proved, it gave some good evidence for that Newton's thing works, right? Works. So Halley's comet is really important for that reason. And why is a high high reality category? Because it doesn't matter the context, right? Because Halley's comet coming in 1682, or whatever number that we put there, that is high representation, right? Is going to be meaningful regardless of whether or not we pay attention to the historical context. On the other hand, chess is low reality, high representation. So chess is nothing but the rules, right? And the game, right? So in order to understand chess, you have to understand context. Right? I thought of chess because there's really popular TV show right now. We discussed it the other day as well. Even though you don't learn anything about chess by watching the show, they just had some words, you know, like Queen's Gambit, Sicilian opening, Italian opening, or whatever. You know, but it's high representation, right? It's just the rules of the game, and you could be playing traditional Indian Western chess, or you could be playing Chinese chess, 象棋. You know, 象棋has similar pieces, you're L-shaped, but you play on the lines. So it's high representation, meaning that it's all the contextual rules is what gives any meaning to the game, any meaning to the act, right? It's low reality. I mean, outside of the fact that you need some maybe pieces and maybe you need something to play it on, the reality dimension of chess is very low. You can play it on your phone, you know, you can play it on a table, you can play it on paper, you can draw it, right? Okay. So the limit here is the question of whether or not they're genuine human cultural universals, right? If there are human cultural universals, then there would be some aspects of this high reality representation that is going to be part of the cultural context as well. And if there's a human cultural universal, then context is not super important either. Right? Do you know what I mean? So if everyone, I don't know, there are very few things like this. Everyone has to eat, right? Let's say we all have to eat one thing, one kind of thing. Right? Let's say we're like cows. We have to eat grass, right? Then we don't have. It doesn't depend on the context, right? Grass will just always be grass, and it's a high reality category. But for some reason, human culture. I mean, this is an institute for cultural studies, so maybe you can tell me. But there are very few cultural universals, and perhaps this is also this traditional question, a humanist question, right? Is there something essential that defines the human being qua human being, or is that question itself an imperialistic question, right? Is that project itself that which was born out of kind of colonialism or something like that, right? We can save that for the discussion. So, for example, quarantine, right? Because we're living now in COVID days, comes from the quarantena, 40 days from the Venetian dialect, right? Decreed by the state senate in 1448, in a society without the germ theory of disease, right? So, 我觉得威尼斯人还蛮厉害的，就是说他们没有任何的这个 germ theory of disease， 他们也知道人要隔离，所以可以解决这个瘟疫的事情的，你不需要有理论，你可以试试看各种东西。So there is no germ theory of disease in Venice, but they knew to quarantine people. That's a very remarkable fact. And so the meaning of quarantine is very different in 1448 and today. Because we have the theory of disease. We know what the quarantine is supposed to do. They didn't know. So on the representation level, it's totally different. On that level, context is important. But whether or not the quarantine was effective, that's a high reality level. It's much more like Halley's comet. right? High reality, right? So the same act, it's the same thing, can have two dimensions, right? It's reality and it's representation. So we can think of the wearing a mask, right? Wearing the mask also has the same meaning, right? Attenuating spread is a high reality dimension. And like representation, right? A representation of social values, a representation of individual liberty, you know, those are all representational dimensions of the quarantine, of the mask. Right? I just thought that was nice to talk about. So okay, 到现在 okay. How much more time do I have? Half hour? 20 minutes? 15 minutes? 5 minutes?
Altogether about 50 minutes to 1 hour for you, and then you have a short break.
一个人大概是原来设计的大概是40到45分钟。
OK，
那个对啊，是对。
OK， 那我就加速阻力 ，OK， 我就 accelerate a little bit， 因为我又自己自我翻，所以我要讲2次。Okay, the circularity of contextualism. What is it? It's very simple, right? So the problem is, and many other scholars have brought this up, that the problem with contextualism and esoteric is the production of a rationality that does not allow the author's intention. This is what contextualism was trying to get rid of, right? But contextualism also allows for the emergence. Rather, this is Skinner's view, right? That contextualism allows the author's locutionary force when the meaning of utterances is determined by context, i.e. a web of speech acts, and understanding of the author achieves meaning. But there's a circularity, right? Because the web is itself a product of judgment, a predetermined selection of the significance of error and the significance of interlocutors. So the point is that you can't ever get rid of judgment from this process, right? You reintroduce it at another level, right? So there's some kind of circularity. We could say it like this. Meaning is determined by the context. What is the context? The context is other texts. Well, what determines the meaning of those texts? Well, context, right? So you end up with this circular thing where the thing that is supposed to define the text is defining the context as well. Right? So you get a kind of circularity, this kind of problem. And next, there's a kind of fundamental irrationality of historical reasoning. Now, irrationality, I don't necessarily mean that it's acting irrational, but it's perhaps irrational. Maybe. So Skinner's web of speech tracks are mutually reinforcing, but there's no guarantee of logical consistency. We agree, we disagree, we make a joke, not for logical reasons, right? So the act is not logical, right? So the web of speech acts is interlinked by action, by a game, not by inference, right? So it doesn't guarantee you that you can have the meaning of the word emerging from the context, because people speaking, they're involved in a language game which is not always about truth or logical, rationality. It's sometimes about political power. It's sometimes about, agents can agree or disagree out of misunderstanding. They can misunderstand each other. They can use ambiguous terms that neither of them understand very well. They can have other motives, political motives, financial motives, right? So what this preserves, rather, what the context preserves is a context for historical mutual interrelation, but not for logical consistency. And there's no guarantee that the words always mean the same thing, because they could all be mistaken wrong term. And there's an exclusionary force of scientific theory, scientific history rather, right? The contextualist necessity of the web of speech tracks can exclude whole episodes of history, because simply we don't have the speech of certain important people that were not considered important at the time, right? So, when they talk about Spartacus, everyone knows Spartacus? Spartacus? Yes. 反正就是奴隶的革命啊，奴隶革命。他们都是不识字的人 ，they are illiterate, right？ 奴隶革命都是不识字的人，而且写他们的人都是为帝国辩护的人， 所以呢，当然我们不可能做出那种历史出来，这些人就永远消失在 contextualism， 对不对？就是 slave revolts, unimportant people considered by the people of the time, they don't have a voice because their voices are not recorded, and those who record them are often on the other side of history, isn't it? So the subaltern does not speak. The traditional response is that of the early century Annales school, a French historical movement of historical research based on the idea of using quote-unquote objective data to address the issue. Economics, sociology. So what we do is we take the best, it's the early century dream that economics and sociology can solve all problems, psychology also, right? So we have statistics, economic records will allow us to make the slaves talk, right? The sociology of the time, the economics of the time, where was there a grain shortage, where was there a revolt. We can use non-human database to allow slaves, some oppressed classes, women, for example, right? Lower class women are able to have their reality reflected in taxation, right? Labor roles, maternity, right? So this traditional response, scientific history. So what we can do is it's a kind of contextualism that is not about the text, right? But it also has the same dream of having this kind of scientific history. So I'm going to jump to a side thing because when I was doing this research, I really found that Jean Rancière is one of the few people that I find really sharp on this issue of how to write a history of people that don't exist in history, right? And he's interestingly he says, this maybe the word is a bit small, so I'll read it, right? So the denunciation of ideology is not science. It's only a vague desire for science, which consumes itself in the resentment toward deceptive power. The becoming science of historical narrative is beyond the alternative between a forgotten death, right, and a petrified one, right? So a death that's either forgotten or a death that is completely set in stone, right? It passes through the mythological confrontation that at once includes and suppresses death. I jump down to the blue part. The silent witness of the tomb is strictly identical to the hidden required by science. The voice of the tomb figures quite well beyond necrophilic phantasm, a precise rationality, that of a new historical science. And here he's critiquing the Annales school, right? All speech production can be represented as the exact expression of what gives it a place, of its own legitimacy. Thus the discourse of the book, as utopian and heterodox as it appears, is always interpretable as doxa, as the expression of a topos. We can state it otherwise. There is no possible heresy. So Rancière is really like throwing open the door, and he's saying, we can't. He's against using these methods to try to control too much how history is to be done, right? And there's a bit of theoretical development here that I'm not going to get into. But what he thinks is most important for history is the legitimacy of the topos, right? And that can only be created by a kind of poetics and not by context. So, of course, I find it attractive. So I'll run through this very quickly, but the case is a scientific term, so it should be high reality, right? But across the 17th century, it's gone through a few times. So the term inertia is coined by Kepler in what? In my notes I wrote it down. I erased it. 好像是 the Nova, yeah, Epitome Astronomiae Copernicanae, 1618, yeah, 1618. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, 1618. He creates the term inertia, and in Latin, inertia just means tiredness. And what he's trying to describe is the trajectory by which a moving body slows down. So the phenomenon we understand now is friction, right? Inertia. But, oh yeah, some other figures. So the high reality portion of inertia is that there's a kind of natural movement of the body, right? So Galileo thought this movement is circular. There's a lot to talk about in here. I'll just go through it very fast. Now, the expression that what we understand by inertia now, inertia 中文怎么说？
惰性，
是物理的那个
惯性，
就是它东西不动，它就会不动；东西动了，它就会维持在那个惯性。然后呢，然后你要把它停下来的话，也是这个也是要有力，要使力，对，才能把它。Descartes is the first person to say it like this. The first law of nature that in each thing as far as in its own power always remains in the same state. And consequently, when it is moved, it continues to move. So this is, he doesn't call it inertia. He doesn't call it inertia, but he defines inertia for the first time. Newton does it in 1678, 1676. No, wait, sorry, 1686. Sorry. The vis insitia, or the innate form of matter, is a power of resisting for each body as much as it lies, endeavors to persevere in its present state. You can see it's exactly what Descartes says. Right. Remains that consequently, in Latin, the famous term is quanta in se est, right? In as much as it can, as much as it lies, right? It's translated in Descartes as far as it is in its power. In quantum in se est. So Newton used, he's not a plagiarist, but maybe he would get in trouble for plagiarism today if he was around. I know there's a big plagiarism thing in Taiwan right now, starting with the president like 3 years ago. But now there's a few.
Okay.
Yeah, plagiarism. But Newton used the term vis inertiae to describe in the definition the cause of this fact that it moves forever. So already up to now we have multiple terms, right? You have the use of the term inertia, but in a totally opposite meaning. Right? Kepler's meaning of inertia is it slows down, not that it stays the same. We have Descartes describing inertia, but not using the term. Now you have Newton bringing it together, but there's still a problem, because Newton doesn't think that this vis insitia is inertia, right? He thinks of inertia as the cause of this insitia. So there's still a difference between what we now call inertia. And then in the last bit with Kant, we have every change of matter has an external cause, right? And then he says in the remark, this mechanical law must be called the law of inertia, lex inertia. So we make a full circle. Number 6, Kant's expression is what we now understand as inertia. But I haven't really written more about this, but I think it's a very good case of understanding that without anachronism, we could never get this story clear. If we rely too much on context, we end up with a very ambiguous term that means everything to everyone. It doesn't mean anything, actually, at the end of the day. But if we use a little bit of anachronism, we can actually string them together in a way that is at least slightly coherent. Right? Okay. So, significant, intensive, but confused term. And it's a classic case of anachronism, right? The figures themselves did not know what they were doing, right? Newton did not use the term inertia for his first law, but as a description of vis insitia, the cause of the resistance to change. So one neutral solution is to use the term proto-inertia, which is what I use in my articles because I don't want to be blacklisted from the contextualist mafia. So to what degree this term refer better to the contextual meaning rather than the anachronistic teleological meaning. Well, that's the problem with the contextualists have, right? The way I interpret it, like in the previous slide, is a teleological interpretation, right? 有目的性的这个解释，就是说 that is to say, from Kepler to Kant, what I'm saying is that there's a line that goes to Kant, and only when we arrive there do we look back and say, ah, that's what they were doing, right? But they were confused for 100 years, right? So the contextualists are against this, right? Because I'm imposing my own judgment on them too much, right? Clear? Okay, good. So inertia is insufficiently high realities, right? So although inertia may originally be seen as high reality, it is objectively a vague term because it can also refer to the effect of friction, right? So the power of the term inertia is largely due to the slippage of meaning between the ambiguity of terms and the ambiguity of phenomena. I'll skip because I actually have gone way over time. So I would say that maybe there's one way we can use it is to use another term, maybe not anachronism, but uchronism, right? An out of time, right? Historical studies treat authors as themselves unable to resolve their own problems. But that's the important, I think, missing point from Skinner, is that Skinner assumes that the authors know what they're doing. I think inertia demonstrates very clearly that the authors do not know what they're doing. Just like we don't know what we're doing, right? So, I have from Hegel the most beautiful passage from the Lectures on Aesthetics. Right. Egypt is the country of symbols, the country which sets itself the spiritual task of self-deciphering of the spirit, without actually attaining to the decipherment. The problem remains unsolved, and the solutions we can provide consist therefore only in interpreting the riddles of Egyptian art and its symbolic works as a problem remaining undeciphered by the Egyptians themselves, right? So that's, I mean, the rest of the quote is, so, he goes on to say, typical kind of Eurocentric was for the reason Egyptians, they are mysterious and dumb, mute and motionless, because here spirit itself has not still really found its own inner life and still cannot speak in a clear and distinct language of spirit, which we have to wait till the Greeks. But what's important here is that I think he identifies a really strong and really important point for the debate with contextualists, is that the mysteries of the Egyptians were mysteries to the Egyptians themselves. Right? So Kepler didn't know what he was doing. Descartes didn't know what he was doing. Galileo didn't know what he was doing. Kant sort of started to know what he was doing, but basically they didn't know what they were doing. The mysteries of the 17th century continental physicists were mysteries to the continental physicists themselves. Okay? That's my perspective. So there's a second case study. I'll go through it super fast, but you're probably more aware of the topic than I am, which is the birth of the term philosophy, 哲学 in Chinese. So there's no such thing as philosophy in pre-modern China, right? 哲学, Tetsugaku, is a Japanese invention by Nishi Amane, 1829 to 1897, and it referred only to Western thought. It referred only to the thought that missionaries, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the British, the Americans have brought in, right? And in that context, 理学, rigaku, was a rival concept, right? So the question is whether or not this kind of foundational learning should or should not include natural science. Right? 理学 actually makes, it's more elegant of the term, 理学, because it has this idea that it's kind of foundational, right? It's the foundational aspect of every logos, right? Every kind of study. So so the real use of 哲学 for Eastern thought, it begins with in February 1887 by Miyake Yujiro. He used the term Tetsugaku instead of Rigaku, so 哲学 instead of 理学. installing the official use for the term 东洋哲学 or 支那哲学. I know recently there's been a kind of controversy on the term 支那. It's interpreted as derogatory somehow to China, but it's from Sanskrit, you know, it's from 梵文, what the ancient Indians described China as. Anyhow, the original canon has Buddhist writings, and it has some of the ones that we're more familiar with now with 秦汉哲学, right? We have the 大学, the Great Learning, we have the 中庸, we have 论语, we have 孟子, okay, 四书道. And then we have 天台 stuff, we got other sutras, we have 诗经, 书经, 易经, 老子, 庄子. 差不多了. So you have the emergence of an original canon based on this idea of a 支那哲学. And then jumping over the strait to China, we have the use of 理学 in borrowed from the Japanese context. Kang You-wei and those have used 哲学 as a subcategory of 理学. And Yang Qiqiao, in this newspaper, 清易报, after he was exiled from China, living in Japan, he used the term 支那哲学 in this reformist journal, 清易报. This is probably every people know this already. And then there's the later reception, which we're much more familiar with, right? 哲学辩护, Wang Guowei, and all the way down. That's the first part of the later reception, right, from the early part of the 20th century. And then we have the mid 20th century, the people associated with 五四运动, 新文化运动, those guys, 胡适, 谢无量, those people from the 1916, 1919 were writing history of Chinese thought. 中国哲学是, 哲学 had already become completely natural part of people thinking about this, with a canon more or less similar to what the Japanese early inventors. So it's funny because Chinese philosophy, 中国哲学, was invented in Japan. I find that very interesting. Yeah. And Fu Youlan basically overthrew all the previous works on Chinese philosophy. Fu Youlan becomes the new foundation for doing Chinese philosophy and established a new kind of ground for doing Chinese philosophy. So in a way, Chinese philosophy is actually a very young field, right? You could trace it back to 1931, basically, right? But within that context, there's also controversy, right? I'll read the Chinese, but Fu Sinian in 1926, basically, after the establishment of Chinese philosophy, he basically says, I do not agree with Wu Shi that we should call a written account of the books of Lao Tzu, Kongzi, Mozi, and others a history of philosophy. There is no such thing as philosophy in China. Thank God for giving our nation such a healthy set of practices. What our country has of philosophy goes only as far as teachers like Socrates. When it comes to Plato, we already do not have a comparable figure, not to mention the specialized philosophy in modern academies like Descartes and Leibniz. If we call our masters, Tzuchien, philosophers, there's a great possibility of misunderstanding. In general, using new terms for all things is permissible for material things because they are similar. High reality, right? But for cultural things, high representation, right? One cannot do this because many may seem similar but actually different. From now, we tentatively call these people, the Tzuchien, esoteric practitioner, 方术家. The thought or 思想家 is best used sparingly. Right? 就是盖汉朝人的东西多半可说思想的，但晚周的东西总应该是说方术啊，就是 the esoteric practices, right? 汉朝以后才有思想 ，OK. So this is a little bit like Heidegger. Heidegger thinks also philosophy ends with Socrates. So this is a nice photo of Tzuchien and Hu Shi together. I'm not sure what year, but Hu Shi also then later in the 20s kind of recants philosophy, right? Interestingly enough, the person, one of the important figures to create it. I'll read the English translation again. The most powerful thing that binds people is what spiders spit out of their own abdomens to bind themselves. In the last few years, I have tried my best to forget what I have learned. For 6 or 7 years, I did not teach Western philosophy or read Western philosophy books. I swept the Westerners' cobwebs. I have felt very happy about this. I am content about arriving at this level because as I am a professor of philosophy, it is not easy to throw away my livelihood. 不容易做到把自己的吃饭家伙丢了。OK， 这是胡适说的，1926年。So we face a kind of inexistence in Chinese philosophy. We live in an inexistence of Chinese philosophy. So it's a cross-cultural, cross-historical invention, right? And it's aware of this, right? It's aware of this. So it's its own thing, but it's a pragmatic invention, a way to reevaluate one's own history within the context of reform, revolution, new imperialism, and new nationalisms. So Chinese philosophy exists as a modern or modernizing category. It exists because it was invented. So it's high representation, but it's neither really high nor low reality. One has to redebate this with between Hu Shi and Fu Shi. So the question I ask is philosophy like a dance or like a ballet, right? So if speaking of universal human, universal human cultures, right? Dance, we can find dance anywhere. You can find dance anywhere. But you can only find ballet if it's traced back to that particular form of dance, right? So the question is philosophy like dance or like ballet? Right? This kind of naturalizing question. So I'll kind of skip this. We've kind of already talked about it. The last two things, I guess, is the point that I want to talk about, right? That I think that there is a philosophical meaning to doing intellectual history. And even though I do think contextualism works or should be the rule for most of the time, I think we miss the point if we try to do contextualism too much, because contextualism throws us into a kind of antiquarianism. The point is, what is the point? Right? The point is that in the third category, I would say there's a kind of Friendliness effect. This is what Brecht talked about in performance. Right? Probably here there are some students studying performance. Performance studies? No? Okay. Just a code. Performance. Okay. Performance, I mean, the point is that one is to try to dislocate you from your own time. Right? Dislocate you from your own language. Dislocate you from your own self-being. Right? The work of art's point is to throw you out of your own center. Right? In that very same way, the study of history is meant to do that. And I think, like on the best, if you read Skinner in his best life, he really does do that, right? He challenges our understanding of what freedom means. But there's possibly another way, right? This is the Friendliness effect, the sort of uncanny effect of watching a decentering kind of performance, is the disruption, is to take something from outside of you, and to disturb you. But maybe we can have an uchronic criticism as well. We disturb the past itself. Are we able to disturb the past itself? So I just conclude with another little bit of Rancière. He says, we conclude the opposite, right? So a historian recently deplored the crisis of self-confidence introduced into his discipline by the rumors and parasitic turmoils of adjacent disciplines that wish to submit it to the evil empire of the text and its deconstruction, to the fatal lack of the distinction between the real and the imaginary. We will conclude the opposite. Nothing threatens history except its own lassitude with regard to the time that it made it, or its fear before that, which makes its material sensitive to its object time, words, and death. History doesn't have to protect itself from any foreign invasion. It only needs to reconcile itself to its own name. Now, take it how you want. Take it how you want. It's a bit rancière doing a bit rancière, but I think it leaves an interesting project to sort of rethink contextualism or allowing contextualism to think about how we should be doing history and how we should be facing texts, the people who cannot speak the texts that are buried. Okay, so I've taken way too much time, so thank you very much for your patience.
就继续吧。
I'm fine. You didn't need a break.
我们是一个5分钟的短短的 break， 还是说继续？
我觉得5分钟。
Vote.
Okay. We take a short break.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay.
And then come back.
Okay.